Welcome to The Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. It's November 29th, 2025. First topic, Tucker Carlson. He put out a video in the last week where he spoke with Piers Morgan, and something about the interview really struck me, and I'm working through what it is, and Ness is going to help me work through it. First, just some observations. We're not going to play clips from the video just because it's kind of hard to isolate them. There wasn't any particular moment that stood out to me. It was more just Tucker Carlson's general demeanor and approach. And so the first thing I noticed was Tucker seemed like in a manic state, just all over the place. All his most, it was almost like a caricature of what Tucker Carlson has been come to be known as. The cackling, the over-the-top histrionic behavior, the personal slights against other people, the contradictions. As an example, he was basically trashing the UK and saying how ever since World War II, it's been on a decline. And he compared it unfavorably to, for example, one of the critiques of the UK was that the British people were not having enough children. Specifically, white Britons were not having enough children. And then he immediately talked about how great Japan was and used it as almost like as a contrast in terms of Japan. He talked how much he loved Japan, and when he goes there, it's such a well-functioning society and everything's great. But Japan has an even worse fertility problem than the UK. And it didn't appear that Tucker recognized that dissonance or potential contradiction. And I'm picking on that because I think that's representative of what he's like all the time. And what, for me, is kind of exhausting watching him, because he's just constantly – he makes some good points, but then he'll just undercut the points, and he doesn't seem to realize what he's doing. And – of course, he's gotten renewed attention most recently with about a month or two ago, which we covered on The Reality Taboo, Tucker Carlson's interview with Nick Fuentes. And there was, of course, a lot of commentary that came out of that interview. Conservatism Inc. probably attacked Tucker most viciously, people like Ben Shapiro. And I think a lot of that criticism was hyperbolic and histrionic, but there were some fair points made. And one of those points is that I think it was Ben Shapiro and maybe others have essentially described Tucker Carlson as a form of or kind of ideological laundering, where Tucker will recognize more of the more extreme or further, more hardcore right-wing viewpoints. And he will bring on, it seems, well, the question is whether Tucker believes these more extreme right-wing perspectives. But I'm talking specific, I would say two main issues are racial matters. So human biodiversity, are there biological, inherent, deep, fundamental differences between various groups of humans, of Homo sapiens? That's number one. And number two would be more the Jewish question, so to speak, like the nature of Jewish people, the nature of their control and influence in 2025 and all that. So those are two big issues that he's bringing on, people that are quote unquote more extreme or outside the Overton window on that issue. He'll bring those people on and give them a friendly, reasonable opportunity to air their viewpoints, but he'll kind of dip his toe into some of them, but he won't go all the way. And so my working hypothesis, I'll turn it over to Ness here, is that Tucker is experiencing cognitive dissonance.
Tucker Carlson is a Johnny-come-lately to the intellectual revolution that's characterized the right over the last 20 or 25 years as the reascendance of the old right, the Buchananite, Joe Sobran, Sam Francis right reasserts itself in a big way, first in 2016 with the election of Trump, but that seemed like it might be an aberration. That's certainly the way that the managerial class treated it initially, and now with it having staying power lasting a decade, and a significant portion of elites, culturally idea-shaping institutions also moving in that direction, of which the Silicon Valley insurgency is probably the most notable, but also as even more salient probably would be Tucker Carlson himself, who is someone who initially would fit comfortably inside of the conservatism, the new right, the conservatism Inc. of the post-Clinton years, but for a variety of reasons over time has ideologically shifted away from that. And we'll probably discuss it in additional detail how genuine that personal conviction is on Tucker Carlson's behalf, if it really is a general or a genuine conversion, or if it is more reading the tea leaves, because this is someone who maintained the most popular cable news show before he was defenestrated entirely from the good graces of corporate media. And now it's interesting, now that he's been thrown out and he's on his own, that they still, these same intellectual gatekeepers on the right are continuing to try to pressure him. And to some extent, it's because he seems like he is susceptible to being pressured, even though his platform ostensibly doesn't need the blessing at all of Conservatism Inc. any longer. And if we dive even deeper into what this means, it could be because he has some potential political aspirations in the future. It's something I'm wrestling with because I'm not exactly sure why he hasn't completely cut himself free of the old Conservatism Inc., why he feels like he needs to continue to pay some deference to it. I think this is a major reason why it seems like when listening to Tucker Carlson, he's kind of all over the place, because he doesn't have the deep-seated intellectual framework to allow him to feel comfortable coming to the conclusions that he has, it appears, been taken to, maybe internally kicking and screaming to some extent, but over the years, it's been clear that he has shifted away from the old Con Inc. consensus and has moved much more in the direction of the what we used to call the Stevosphere, the idea that human biodiversity matters and that individualism is not compatible with a maintaining of Western civilization as Tucker Carlson knows it. As far as the seeming contradiction between criticizing the United Kingdom for low birth rates while in the next moment praising Japan for being an orderly society, there are two major meta issues that the HBD realists have identified for the 21st century, and that Tucker Carlson is seeming to wrestle with now. And those two there is some overlap, but they are quite distinct. One of them is the decline, the seeming inexorable decline in fertility rates across the developed world, for not just the Western world, but also East Asia, and even more so in East Asia. And then separate from that is the demographic question in terms of race and ethnicity. And those two things, again, there is some overlap between them, but even devoid of immigration and the so-called Great Replacement that is taking place across the West, even without the infusion of non-Europeans all over the Western world, there is separately the problem of plummeting birth rates among Europeans, among people of the European diaspora, white people, and it's not realistically something that can be attributed entirely or even significantly to the demographic change. And that problem is even more pronounced in East Asia, but they do not have in East Asia the same problem with racial dilution. It's not a great replacement in South Korea or in Japan or in China. It is simply a great disappearance. And Tucker understands that Japan is doing better on the racial dilution side of things. And so he somewhat lazily also seems to insinuate that they must be doing better on the fertility side of things, or he just doesn't have those two things tidily separated in his mind.
That's an important distinction, those two distinct ideas that Tucker in some way seems to be conflating. It's definitely true that Japan, on the race, at least if you believe racial homogeneity is a good thing, Japan is in a much, much better position than the United Kingdom. However, there are some signs that things are changing in Japan. There is more and more talk and actual action of bringing in non-Japanese people into Japan. And there is, I don't know how the new prime minister, I think she's the first female prime minister, she seems to be in the mold of Abe. But I don't know exactly what the dynamics there are, and I don't know where she fits in. But there is a growing anti-immigrant movement in Japan. So it'll be interesting to see how that, if Japan continues on that path of bringing in more and more non-Japanese people.
The neoliberal framework almost compels that, and that is where, when I mentioned that they're not the same thing, there is some overlap, and the overlap is most strongly felt when it comes to what neoliberalism demands, which is perpetual growth and continual open markets and the free movement of labor and people. And to perpetuate growth, it is assumed that there must be a growing population. And so if you have fertility problems, then that opens the door for the presumed need for additional migration.
So Ness mentioned HBD. Just to reiterate, it stands for human biodiversity, and it's the position that Homo sapiens are split into distinct groups, or what we call races, and those races are deep and biological and have significant implications. And I'm going to see if Ness, this is kind of what I synthesized with Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson knows human biodiversity is correct, but he can't bring himself to admit it. Instead, he tries to shoehorn his own neoliberal individualist ideology to arrive at HBD conclusions, and it simply doesn't work. So Ness agrees with that.
Generally, yes, but I don't think it's nearly that rigid. I think in the more commonly understood vernacular, HBD is just the idea that nature matters, that it's not just nurture. They're not necessarily that there are hard and fast distinctions that characterize or that categorize different groups into different races. I think the idea of race, it does matter in the same way that family matters, and almost everybody inherently understands that there are characteristics that families exhibit and that siblings tend to be more like one another than they are like other people in the neighborhood. But there isn't a hard and fast line that says this person is completely a member of this race and that person is a completely distinct member of a different race. Race is an extended family with a lot of interbreeding over the centuries and millennia, but there is some interbreeding across race. So in terms of understanding the world through an HBD lens, it's the same way that you understand social dynamics through a family lens, even if you can't make a hard and fast determination of what constitutes being a member of a family, of someone else's family. Obviously, your brother is a member of your family and your dad's a member of your family, but is your third cousin? Maybe not, but still, family has some utility in understanding social dynamics, even if the distinctions aren't always hard and fast. And so that's the only quibble I would have with Jeff's assessment, that I don't think that these are necessarily distinct, deeply ingrained, inseparable, like that different races mix like oil and water. I don't think that is necessarily the case, but it is important to understand that biology does matter and that there are a whole host of characteristics and attributes that clutter more with certain races than others. And most importantly, apropos Tucker Carlson and politics and culture, that if you don't take that into account, then your conclusions are going to be largely incorrect, and a lot of your thinking is not going to make sense because it's going to be based on the idea that nurture is everything and nature doesn't matter at all.
And I would argue that this dissonance that Tucker is experiencing, where he knows that HBD is real, but he won't come right out and acknowledge it, I think that's psychologically tearing him apart. And there are too many internal contradictions, and those are expressed in the manic behavior he exhibited during his conversation with Piers Morgan. So moving away specifically from HBD to other contradictions in the interview, Carlson implies that everyone should be able to say faggot or the N-word. Then he immediately, it's a weird thing he does. He says faggot like 10 times in the interview. Or maybe not that many, I don't want to exaggerate, but several times. And it's kind of bizarre. And he like baits Piers Morgan, like, Tucker presents himself as bold and iconoclastic.
The same stood out to me. It almost seems like he was fetishizing the word. He did say it multiple times beyond what was necessary to make his point, and it was clear that he was enjoying the fact that he was able to shoot barbs at Piers Morgan for not being able to say faggot. But then, of course, he walked right into the trap with the word nigger, which he wouldn't say. He wouldn't say the N-word. So he gave Piers Morgan all this grief for not saying what is colloquially known as the F-word, but Tucker Carlson wouldn't say the N-word. So there isn't some hard and fast principle here. It's just a sliding scale of preference. And I think this goes to what I deem the Harry Potterization of Western society, the idea that certain syllables, that certain sounds that come out of our mouths have these incredible powers that can cause the universe to collapse on itself. That is what wokeism is fundamentally about. The idea that if you say these things that you're not supposed to say, if you dare say Voldemort's name, then evil is going to befall you. And Tucker Carlson sort of gets that. He gets the idea, but he won't take it to its logical conclusion because the consequences he perceives to be too grim for him. And so in that way, what he's doing to Piers Morgan there is kind of gross, because he is insulting Piers Morgan for being afraid to say the F word, because Piers Morgan knows he'll get in trouble for saying the F word, but then Tucker Carlson won't say the N word because Tucker Carlson knows he'll get in trouble for saying the N-word. And there is a bigger meta point there where all of the criticisms that Tucker Carlson is laying against Piers Morgan's home country of the United Kingdom are as relevant, as germane to the problems that the United States is experiencing, in a lot of ways even more so, maybe not so much on the free speech front, but in that context, America's just a little bit behind Great Britain, still going in the same direction. So in Great Britain, you can't say the F word or the N word. In America, you can just say the F word, but not the N word. As far as getting at Tucker Carlson's personality quirks, I think Tucker Carlson is quite unique in that he is one of the few people who monologues much better than he interviews with other people. Generally, monologuing is much more difficult to do. Having conversations is a lot easier. There are cues to respond to, there are breaks, there are thought patterns that are able to be followed. Standing up and just monologuing is really hard for most people, but Tucker Carlson is remarkably good at it. He famously gives all of his speeches, his public addresses to Turning Point USA and to the Republican National Conference and at Charlie Kirk's memorial even, goes up without notes and just extemporaneously delivers lines, and his monologues are really good because he does that. But it seems like when he is forced to respond to other people, he can't keep his focus. I don't know if it is part of his addict's personality where certain things trigger him. He just emotionally feels more than a lot of people do, and so he gets taken off track. But when he monologues, he is able to keep all of that at bay.
Yes, and he was an alcoholic, I believe, for decades, and he became sober well into his adulthood. And I also believe as a child with his brother, I know he was a big fan of Grateful Dead, so I think he used a lot of recreational drugs in his youth. And so, yeah, I think that explains part of, again, what I can just best describe as a manic episode that he seemed to be exhibiting during this interview. And on that idea that has the addict's tendency to be very sensitive, have experience big emotions, the famous Tucker cackle or laugh is perhaps a representation of that. He just has too much energy inside of him, and it just escapes via his strange cackle.
Like, what is that? I think Jeff just got at what it is.
All of those descriptions are mostly psychological and a description of Tucker Carlson. I think they're premised on all the observations we've made about Tucker and speculating about why he's doing what he's doing. Those are, I believe, all premised on the idea that Tucker Carlson is a good faith actor. And I'm not sure that's the case. And the reason I'm not part of it is intuition. I think there are some specifics to back it up, but there's something uncanny about Tucker where I can't quite discern what his agenda is, and people have speculated all over the place. I mean, we just did some speculation on I guess we just gave the case that he's acting in good faith and that his quirks are just a natural expression of his personality. But I think he might have more of an agenda. And I'm not sure what that agenda is, but for instance, Tucker Carlson gets very, very sensitive when anybody talks about his dad. Famously, he got really triggered by Nick Fuentes saying that Tucker Carlson's dad was in the CIA, and Tucker Carlson makes all these like pedantic distinctions, or lies, I would say. He downplays Dick Carlson's role working for Voice of America and his connection to the CIA. So yes, it appears that Dick Carlson, Tucker Carlson's dad, didn't work directly for the CIA, but he worked for a cutout of the CIA. And Tucker pretends like this is like it's absurd to claim that his dad had anything to do with the CIA. And he even claims famously that he said after his dad only died like a year or two ago, I think. And when his dad died, Tucker claimed that he had just recently learned that his dad was involved with the CIA. And it's just absurd. There are clips of Tucker Carlson talking years ago where it was obvious he knew what his dad was doing. And we played a clip in a previous episode, Tucker Carlson speaking with Dave Rubin. Is interestingly, like Tucker Carlson apparently has a big beef with, well, Dave Rubin is Jewish, so of course after October 7th and Palestine and Gaza, all that, Tucker Carlson and Dave Rubin are no longer friendly, but they were in 2021, I believe. And Tucker Carlson I'll never forget seeing it. It stands out to me. Tucker Carlson just says, something to the effect of, I lie all the time. I try not to, but I lie. And he just acknowledged it. And so, I mean, if it were true a couple years ago, coming out of it, I don't know why else you would, again, it's like, it's a sort of statement against interest. Like, I don't know why you would possibly say that about yourself unless it were true. So assuming that it is true, Tucker is still lying all the time. And so what's he lying about now?
Yeah, I think I can offer two magnanimous responses in Tucker Carlson's favor. To what extent they're true versus to what extent I'm just giving him the benefit of the doubt, will leave as an exercise to the listener. But in the case of Tucker Carlson's father, I think this is a very understandable, or at least it used to be, it's becoming less so understandable, honor response. The idea Tucker Carlson has pretty consistently said over the years that family first, family is the most important thing, and that the idea of putting some sort of ideological principle ahead of family is something that Tucker Carlson finds abhorrent, which is quite out of step with the 21st century Western concept of things, where it is considered much worse to hypocritically support your family member than it is to cut your family member out for doing something that is against your morals and your belief system. But Tucker Carlson has never, so far as I know, publicly subscribed to that idea. And so just as he defended Chris Cuomo for backing his brother, Andrew Cuomo, and Chris Cuomo was in the media just like Tucker Carlson, and putatively the purpose of media personalities delivering news is to deliver the truth, and yet Tucker Carlson very much sympathized with Chris Cuomo lying to protect his brother. So I think that is one aspect when it comes to family and his father. And as far as his talking about how he lies on Dave Rubin's show, I think that could be more charitably attributed to Tucker Carlson's Christian journey if you just replace lie with sin. Like, yeah, I'm a Christian. I sin all the time. I'll sin some more. But the idea is you're trying to work not to sin, to try to stop sinning as often. And I think in the context of what Tucker Carlson was saying there is that he realizes that he has faults, as all fallen people do, and that he tells these white lies, or maybe sometimes more than just white lies, and he is aware of that, and he's trying to move away from that. And so I think in the bigger context, I think to put it in the broader context of Tucker Carlson, my overall assessment is, yeah, he has a lot of issues, as most people do, but that his primary purpose is as a popularizer, and he is moving in the right direction over time. His arc is to become better and better over time. And so I get less hung up over the little idiosyncrasies that he demonstrates than Jeff does.
Well, I agree largely with the latter point about the comment about lying, that you could replace that with sin, and it's related to Tucker's, which seems genuine, his rediscovery of his Christian faith. But on the first point about Tucker's dad, I think I see things differently on that point. I think Tucker, there's some sort of projection going on, because Nick Fuentes, for example, who was very public about, I would say, well, when Nick Fuentes, he did an episode about Tucker Carlson and his dad, Richard Carlson's connection to the CIA. At least I can only speak for myself. That was the first time I really realized how deeply connected Dick Carlson was to the CIA and more broadly the deep state. And most of it was not an attack. It was there was some criticism in there, but the vast majority was just revealing what Dick Carlson did and what his role was. So Tucker Carlson portrays it as, oh, they're just attacking his dad, and that's really not what was happening. Because if to me, the gaslight, or not the projecting on Tucker's part is that he has, one of his big criticisms nowadays is he goes after the deep state and talks about how much of a nefarious presence the deep state is. Well, his own dad worked in the deep state. And I think that's where the anger comes out, because Tucker, again, maybe there's another form of cognitive dissonance, because Tucker's attacking the deep state and when his own dad was a member of the deep state, and it kind of, undermines Tucker's position potentially when it's revealed that his dad worked for the deep state.
Well, again, to be more charitable, if we see a parallel here with his overall intellectual journey from Con Inc. to HBD realism, we see that he seems to have had a sort of scales falling from his eyes, and he's seeing the light, but he is hesitant to let go of the worldview that buttressed his previous beliefs. And so being part of Con Inc. and thinking of the CIA and the FBI, the American empire, as the good guys, and now having to see them as the bad guys, that's a hard adjustment to make, and to re-inject the honor aspect of it. It seems genuine to me from all that I've heard that he dearly loved his dad and had a great relationship with his dad. And so it is hard for him to, if he's starting to think of the managerial state as the bad guy, well, he doesn't want to think of his dad as the bad guy. And so he wants to still think of his dad as a good guy because his dad was a good guy in his own mind. And so he's wrestling with these ideas. And so I'm sure he would prefer that people just not talk about his dad so that he can maintain in his own head the idea that his dad was a good guy. And the more emphasis that is put on his dad's role as a member of the deep state, the harder it is for him to hold those positions on an emotional level.
I think there is some obligation if you're going to be a public intellectual, though, on something like that, even if your family, you don't have to. I think there's almost a false choice being made here. Tucker can both acknowledge his dad's role in the CIA and not be evasive about it. At the same time, he doesn't also need to trash his father. Like, those are not mutually exclusive. He can acknowledge that Dick Carlson worked for the deep state, and he can also be a critic of the deep state. But I think there's a blatant deception lying going on. And I don't think that's right. But that kind of is a nice segue into something else we want to talk about. I'm going to present 3 categories of people, and we're going to try to see where people like Tucker Carlson fit in. So there are thinkers, influencers, and wielders of power. And Ness, you put Tucker Carlson in the influencer category, right?
Yes, with those 3 categories broadly laid out, I think that is by far where his abilities are strongest, and he has leaned into those over the course of his career. I do think that he may be, this is speculation on my part, as I alluded to earlier, I do think he may be trying to branch out from just being an influencer to being someone who is able to wield power. And I think there is a trap for many people, speaking for myself in the past anyway, to think that because influence is able to be wielded, that translates, even if not directly, it indirectly translates into the ability to wield power, because if you're an influencer, you're able to influence people in power to do things that they might not otherwise do. And that is probably what Tucker Carlson's intentions were with the second Trump administration. He was very influential, arguably, in getting Trump elected for a second time, but we've seen that influence, despite being the most popular, probably the most popular political pundit in America sustainably over time, and who had maintained an ongoing open line of communication with Donald Trump for over 10 years, despite that influence, it seems like he has had no ability at all to wield power by proxy through anything that the second Trump administration has done. And so I speculate that he may be attempting to move in to have some direct ability to wield power. I don't think it is beyond the realm of possibility that he runs for president in 2028. Apropos of you bringing up these 3 categories, I think some of the concerns that you have with how Tucker Carlson conducts himself, those might be put at ease in understanding that he is an influencer and not a thinker. I think almost definitionally someone who has that level of prominence is not going to be someone who is an original thinker, because most people, the vast majority of people, don't want to hear things that they are not on board with. They want to, for the most part, hear things that they already agree with, and they want to hear them in a way that they find compelling and charismatic. And so to be an influencer is to understand what the ideas that thinkers have put forward, and being able to synthesize those in a way that a large portion of people find compelling. I think I brought him up a couple times. Steve Saylor is a perfect example of someone who is entirely a thinker and not at all an influencer or a wielder of power, almost to a comical degree. And there was a lot of frustration in the mid-teens with Steve Sailer among the online right that got behind Donald Trump. And in retrospect, I think they were unfair to Steve Sailer because the expectation was that Steve Sailer would say, hey, here is the manifestation of my ideas coming to life. And yet Steve Sailer was sort of cool on Donald Trump because he didn't like him for a lot of reasons that are quirks of personality or whatever the reasons. The expectation was that Steve Sailer was suddenly going to be this intellectual influencer because of all the ideas that he had spent tirelessly arguing for over the last 15 or 20 years now seem to be being brought to life in Donald Trump. And why isn't he rallying behind Donald Trump? And it's because Steve Sailer isn't interested in that at all. He's not interested in influencing other people, and he's certainly not interested in wielding power. He's just interested in thinking deeply about things and recognizing patterns and making connections and pointing those things out to the detriment of just about everything else in his life.
Yes, and Steve Sailer, I think, had a lot of opportunity. He could have made a lot more money than he did, but his intellectual rigor and honesty as a thinker, and when we should clarify, thinker is somebody who's interested in ideas for their own sake. So perhaps the best archetype are philosophers, somebody like Socrates, who gave his own life for the pursuit of intellectual truth. And so Steve Sailer could have gained much monetary reward by sacrificing those intellectual pursuits, and he didn't. Tucker Carlson, in my mind, is the complete opposite. I would say at every stage of his career, he has chosen, when there was a sort of a fork in the road between intellectual rigor and material wealth and benefit, he took the material wealth. With the possible exception being the events surrounding Tucker Carlson being fired from Fox News, that's the only time you can think maybe Tucker took the path of intellectual rigor and consistency and basically saying, I'm going to express what I really feel unfiltered, even at the cost of losing out on some money. But every other time in his career, and that was, keep in mind, that happened in his 50s. But I would say everything prior to that, he took the path of material wealth. So unlike Steve Sailer.
I think that fits into the transition we're seeing in Tucker Carlson over time, seemingly late in life, but one where he's moving in the broadly right direction, but he still has a long way to go. We are talking about conversations that Tucker Carlson had with Piers Morgan and with Ted Cruz, and anyone who listens to his podcast is struck by him receiving millions, tens of millions of downloads, just how chock full all of his podcasts are with advertisements shows that he is still interested in that material accumulation. And that is at the risk of sounding like comic book guy on The Simpsons complaining about how Itchy and Scratchy owes so much to him after giving him countless hours of entertainment for free, and all he has to do is put up with the commercials. But I am
worst episode ever.
Yeah, I'm going to be comic book guy in this context, not necessarily to bitterly complain, but just to point it out that Tucker Carlson does continue to utilize his influence to feather his own nest quite well.
So this tripartite scheme we constructed here of thinkers, influencers, and wielders of power, I think could apply in a lot of different contexts. But for our purposes, we're looking at the new right. And so I think some names for thinkers on the new right that Ness and I agree are people like Steve Sailer, Andrew Anglin, Vox Day, Gregory Hood, Curtis Yarvin, Pat Buchanan, Sam Francis, Carl Schmitt, Nietzsche. The new right influencers would include figures like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, Matt Walsh. And I think part of my frustration with Tucker Carlson could be explained by me not recognizing that he's an influencer and not a thinker. And so the disconnect comes because I'm applying standards you would apply to a thinker. I'm applying that to an influencer, and Tucker is not a thinker.
Conversely, I think that is why I have a more positive view of Tucker Carlson, especially the most recent iteration of Tucker Carlson, because a lot of the thinkers that I am simpatico with, I think that he is taking their thought and using his influence to spread it far and wide, to kind of dovetail with the accurate criticism that Jeff mentioned earlier that Ben Shapiro made of Tucker Carlson. It's just, I see that as a good thing rather than a bad thing. Doubly so because I think that Tucker Carlson is making a move to leverage his high level of influence to actually wield some power. And so if in the person of Tucker Carlson, if I can see the world views of Vox Day and Steve Saylor being shared far and wide by someone with aspirations for power in the United States, I don't know what more I could really ask for in a person, in a media figure, than what Tucker Carlson is providing.
And you mentioned Ben Shapiro. So with Ben Shapiro, I think there is some deception going on, but part of why I'm not as disturbed by what Ben Shapiro's doing is because once you understand that Ben Shapiro is Israel first and a Jewish nationalist, everything he does makes sense. So there's not like an uncanny experience I have when I'm watching Ben Shapiro, because I know what he's doing and it seems very clear. But with Tucker Carlson, his agenda, at least to me, remains opaque. And perhaps that's the point. He triggers this reaction precisely because I can't figure him out. Even though whatever his agenda might be, I think Ness and I would both agree that it's less hostile to Heritage America than Shapiro's worldview is. And you could object that this amounts to expecting too much from media personalities, as we discussed. It's inevitable, perhaps, that popularizers will be inconsistent, and Carlson is merely fulfilling that role as an influential commentator rather than as a rigorous thinker. And I guess the disturbing quality for me, now that I think about it, doesn't come from Tucker being objectively worse than other media figures, but it's there's a disorienting inability to decode what his true intentions, what his whether he is a good faith actor or not.
Yes, that's the criticism I would level at you, Jeff, with your assessment here. The idea that you are more triggered by Tucker Carlson than by Ben Shapiro, when Ben Shapiro has much more nefarious aims for what happens to Heritage America than Tucker Carlson does. And I think realistically, to realize anything that the HBD, Heritage America, realist right wants to have realized, there is no clear-cut way, there is no formula to follow to realize that, because it's been so frustratingly failing in every attempt. Everyone who has tried to go on that journey from thinker to influencer to wielder of power, from the HBD race realist right side of things, has floundered spectacularly. There's so many careers that have cratered and gone up in smoke trying to walk that line. And so it makes sense that we're not going to be able to entirely understand it or be able to have some frame of reference to put it in if that is what Tucker Carlson is actually doing here. Because if he's going to have a chance at being successful, it's going to have to be something that we don't completely grok here on the ground level. I think our assessments of Tucker Carlson are pretty similar. There are idiosyncrasies, to put it generously, or character flaws, maybe more critically, that seem to stick in your craw more than they do in mine, because I'm not as concerned about him being a perfect person. I mean, to put this in understandable, recognizable, modern political discourse, I was a big booster of Donald Trump in 2016, definitely more so than in 2020 or 2024. And that was totally understanding that Donald Trump as a person left much to be desired in the character department, but there was no reason I saw to get hung up about that because somebody like Donald Trump is not someone I look to for philosophical understanding of the world. Instead, I look at someone who is going to wield power in a way that benefits the things that I am concerned with, that benefit Heritage America, certainly more than the rest of the political class at the time.
And no better proof of that is the fact that supposedly there are 0 illegal aliens crossing the border right now, and nobody else but Trump could have done that.
Precisely. And that'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.